be deprived from academic sessions starting today as private school operators have announced of discontinuing online classes, citing it was impossible to continue with the alternative pedagogy as the government restricted them from collecting tuition fees during the lockdown period. The onus has been and is still on the government to formulate a strategy that the public and the school operators can both implement for a headway. Good morning, I'm Sarah Sapsanama and these are the headlines of the hour. Government's outstanding expenses for the fiscal year 2075-76 stands at over 664 billion rupees. Finance and Defence Ministries lead in financial indiscipline. Private schools pile pressure on the government to collect fees of the lockdown period, announce of halting online classes from today. Liquidity amount of almost 300 billion rupees remain in different banks. Loan demands fail to increase even after the relaxation of the lockdown. And Liverpool's hopes of setting a new English Premier League record end after suffering a 2-1 loss against Arsenal, failed to break the city's record of 100 points. It has been understood that the government's outstanding expenses for the fiscal year 2075-76 stands at over 664.44 billion rupees. Based on the 57th annual report published by the Office of the Auditor General, the office audited transactions worth 6,122.49 billion rupees this fiscal year. This includes transactions of 5,619 units, including the federal, provincial and local level governments and various other government organizations, committees and district coordination committees. Following the audit, the Office of the Auditor General has stated the 3,110 federal units have an outstanding amount of 71.06 billion rupees out of the total 1,756 billion rupees audited. Out of the 189 billion rupees audited at the provincial level, the office stated 998 provincial level offices had 8.2 billion rupees outstanding expense. Likewise, out of the 740 billion rupees audited at the 753 local level governments, the report states 38.13 billion rupees is outstanding. The Finance Ministry alone has 19.6 billion rupees outstanding expenses. Likewise, the Ministry of Physical Infrastructure and Transport has 14 billion rupees and the Defence Ministry 9 billion rupees outstanding amount. The Prime Minister's Office and the Ministry of Drinking Water have 4 billion rupees each, while the Urban Development Ministry has 3 billion rupees and the Education Ministry has 2 billion rupees. The report states that the government has purchased vehicles worth 6 billion rupees in a single year, which is 400% more than the allocated budget. Likewise, the government has continued with its trend of transferring the allocated budget for one purpose to another. The report states that around 300 billion rupees was transferred for other purposes under the influence of leaders and high-level administrators. The report has also suggested that leaders and officials have not refrained from spending the state coffers for their personal interests. Private school operators have announced to discontinue online classes from today onwards, citing that the governments had failed to address their problems as they have been barred from collecting fees. However, the government has not responded at a time when students have been deprived of their right to education. Academic activities in educational institutions across the country have been suspended since 24th of March due to the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown. Most of the private schools have been conducting virtual classes for students having access to the internet. However, the classes could not get official recognition as the government has prohibited schools from collecting tuition fees. While private school operators were collecting admission and tuition fees unilaterally despite the government's restriction, parents, however, are still ambiguous as the government could not issue proper guidelines and fix fees regarding the virtual classes. Meanwhile, the private school operators have decided to suspend all online classes today onwards. Private and Boarding Schools Organization PAPSON and National Private and Boarding Schools Association Nepal and PAPSON issued a joint statement yesterday and announced the suspension of the alternative teaching method, citing that they are unable to engage teaching faculties without paying them. They have decided to send their entire teaching faculty on unpaid home leave until further notice. Majority of the teachers out of the 1,000 teaching faculty of 7,000 private schools could not receive their monthly salary since the beginning of the lockdown. Private school operators that were overcharging fees in normal days but were reluctant in disbursing salary properly to teachers are demanding to collect fees like in normal times. Students across the country, meanwhile, have been deprived of education, while the government seems to be unwilling in drafting proper guidelines that would make online classes effective and fix fees which would be acceptable to all. The number of coronavirus cases in the country has climbed to 17,177 as 160 new cases were reported yesterday. The total number includes 6,114 active cases. Likewise, the death toll has reached 39 as one more death due to COVID-19 was reported yesterday. A 36-year-old man from Rohtahat succumbed to the virus while receiving treatment at Narayani Hospital in Birganj. The deceased man had returned from India and tested positive for COVID-19. Earlier, the deceased's brother had also died in India due to coronavirus. Meanwhile, Surkhet reported the highest 28 coronavirus cases yesterday. 13 cases each were reported from Nawalparasi East and Saptari, 9 from Myagdi, 8 each from Chitwan and Dhanusha, 7 from Kathmandu and 5 from Rohtahat. According to spokesperson for the Health Ministry, Dr. Jageshwar Gautam, 5,090 real-time PCR tests were carried out yesterday, taking the total tests through the PCR method to 298,829. 26 laboratories across the country have been carrying out coronavirus tests through the PCR method as of yet. 24,527 individuals are in various quarantine centers and 6,113 in isolation centers across the country. 697 individuals were discharged yesterday following full recovery, taking the total number of recoveries in the country to 11,025. According to the Health Ministry, Nepal's recovery rate stands at 64.2%. Moving on, although various banks had experienced liquidity crisis last year, they are facing excess liquidity this year. Even after the relaxation of the lockdown, loan demands remain low, resulting in liquidity worth almost 300 billion rupees. It may be recalled between June to July last year, various commercial banks had faced liquidity crisis. Towards mid-June last year, banks had liquidity of only 33 billion rupees. However, the scenario is quite different this year. Commercial banks have liquidity worth 177 billion rupees at the moment. More people have been depositing money compared to those seeking for loans. Despite the easing of the lockdown, business activities have not gained momentum yet. Likewise, remittance deposit has continued while expenses on consumable items have gone down, contributing to the surplus. Based on latest data, 199 billion rupees has been deposited in different commercial banks since the lockdown began back in March, while loan amount of 3 billion rupees has been returned to various banks. Banks are only allowed to invest 80% of the total deposit on loan, which means banks cannot break the 80% ceiling of cash concentration and disbursement ratio of 70%. The scenario indicates that banks can at the moment invest 3 billion rupees. However, while banks have reduced interest on deposit by 1% during the lockdown period, they have yet to implement such a reduction in interest rates on loan. Senior Superintendent of Police SSP Rajendra Adhikari has been arrested in rape allegation charges. Adhikari, who is also the head of the Armed Police Force Training Center in Pokhara, has been accused of sexually assaulting a woman at his own quarter. According to spokesperson for Kaski Police Subhash Hamal, the victim had lodged the complaint by phone. The victim had called the control room of the District Police Office Kaski at 2 yesterday afternoon. According to the victim, Adhikari invited her to his quarter for lunch and had raped her. The Kaski police have carried out medical tests of the victim. SSP Adhikari had just been transferred to this training center on Tuesday. In our Public Voice segment, we had asked the locals in Udaipur district what measures have they adopted to minimize the risk of natural disasters. Let's take a look at what they had to say.
हामी चाहिँ यहाँ चाहिँ एकदम सुरक्षाको नीतिहरू अपनाइरहेका छौँ अनि यहाँ बाढी पहिरो आएको बेला चाहिँ अब यहाँको पानी एकदम यहाँ बहा भएर यहाँ पानी चाहिँ जम्ने खतरा छ एकदमै अनि यहाँको कुनै घरको पानी छिरे पनि अरूको घरमा छरछिमेकीमा गएर पनि बस्ने साधनहरू अपनाइरहेका छौँ।
घर नजिकै ठुलो खहरे बग्छ यहाँनिर यसमा जस्तै बच्चाहरूलाई बाहिर निस्किन दिँदैनौँ आफू पनि निस्किँदैनौँ अनि खोला छ नजिकै खोलातिर गइँदैन
सबै कलसल सबै डुबेको थियो अनि घरभित्रै बस्यौँ त्यही अब पानी अलिअलि बोलाउँदै खानासाना पकाएर खायौँ सकेको ठाउँमा हामीले खोल्यौँ पानी खनेर खोलेर चाहिँ कटायौँ होइन जति सक्दो घरभित्र त छिर्नु त छैन तर छिर्थ्यो त्यो हामीले नखोलेको भए त्यसरी गरेर नै हामीले चाहिँ आफ्नो बचाउ चाहिँ गरिरहेछौँ।
कहाँ हुन्छ उच्च ठाउँ त्यहाँ हामीले बस्नुपर्ने हो अब यो खोला नाला छेउमा यताउति बसेर हामीले त उपाय छैन आज हो कि भोलि हो अब पहाडी भेगमा पनि बस्दा पनि पहिरोको डर हुने सम्भावना।
And time now for our segment Public Pulse, where you text us with your opinion.
Public Pulse.
The question is, what's your take on the government's decision to purchase vehicles worth 6 billion rupees within a year? Your options are A, necessity, B, heights of luxury, and C, commission gain. The voting is on. Type NEWS, select your option A, B or C and send it to 34001 to share your opinion with us. That's all for the moment. Thank you for watching. Have a great day ahead.